Was this guy trying to conceal his address for some reason? And why else would you behave that way if you weren't trying to conceal your address? Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please do subscribe. And if you're old here, hello again. My name's Kate Philpott, this is Sandy, and I cover true crime cases on my channel. In today's video, I'll be covering an Irish case actually, which really leaves you wondering. I mean, for there to be so many suspects and still no answers after so many years, mad. And it's also really bizarre for me to think about because this case takes place in South Dublin in 1999, and I actually lived in South Dublin in 1999. Granted, I was only 3 years old, but still. Quick little disclaimer though, I don't claim to be an expert in any of these cases. Everything I mention is just what I've found online and merged into the one video. And I mean no disrespect to anyone, particularly if there are details that are inaccurate or left out. But let's get into this case. On the 3rd of September 1999, a 17-year-old girl was found brutally murdered just 50 yards from her home in South Dublin. This is Raonaid Murray's story. Raonaid Murray was born on the 1st of January 1982 in Dublin. Her father's name was Jim and her mother's name was Deirdre. She was the youngest of 3 kids, having an older brother and sister. Raonaid was wise, soft-spoken, and also very well-mannered, and she loved reading and poetry. In fact, she actually wanted to become a writer. But she was also quite a bit of crack, she was well liked among her peers, and she had quite the social circle. Her friends were kind of alternative, like for the most part a gothic kind of crowd. They would wear mostly black, but that's why Raonaid stood out, because she actually wore brighter colours. And there was some underlying tension in her friend group, but it wasn't anything too intense or anything people really thought much of. Raonaid was redoing her Leaving Cert in the Institute of Education, aka the Institute, and the Leaving Cert is your equivalent to your A-levels in the UK or your SATs in the US. She also had a part-time sales assistant job in a shop called Sally West, and this was in Dunleary. It was like a fashion boutique, kind of just your typical retail job really. And she was actually working in that shop until 9 p.m. on the day she died. So let's talk about that day. Like I said, Raonaid was in work that Friday evening right up until 9 p.m, but her mum actually popped in earlier that day because she wanted Raonaid's help in picking out an outfit for her dad's birthday. They got her all sorted, and Deirdre remembers Raonaid saying, "Bye mum, I'll see you later." Deirdre obviously didn't realise it at the time, but these would be the last words Raonaid would ever speak to her. So then 9 p.m. comes and Raonaid gets off work, and she actually doesn't go straight home. She goes to Scott's pub, which was just across from where she worked. You know, she did have a pretty decent social life, and this was a Friday night, so it wasn't all that unusual. And originally her plans were actually to babysit that night, but the family had cancelled on her. And it's really things like that that get you thinking, if that family hadn't cancelled on her, would what happened to her have happened at all? Regardless, Raonaid spent just over 2 hours in Scott's pub, and even at that point she wasn't quite ready to go home, but she was still in her work clothes that she'd been in all day. So she wanted to get home and get changed into something nicer and grab a bit of money maybe, and then she was going to head back out and meet her friends again, and they were going to go to a nightclub. Her home was only a 15-minute walk away from Scott's pub, so it really shouldn't have taken her long. And also she'd done it so many times before. Like, she knew those streets like the back of her hand. Like, she knew where she was going, she knew the quickest way to get there. And not only had she done it so many times before, but she'd done it so many times before on her own. And something really important to note, obviously this is in the 90s. People weren't quite as aware as we are nowadays of, you know, the dangers and stuff. And also in this area, crime rates were really low. Nothing bad ever really happened there, and Raonaid had no cause for concern. So with that, she set off home at 11:20 p.m. and Raonaid's body and a substantial amount of blood was found by her sister Sarah at 12:20 p.m, an hour later. So what happened in that time frame? Here's what we know. 11:20 p.m. she leaves Scott's pub. We don't have a whole lot to go off until 11:53 p.m. and this is when a motorist spotted a girl matching Raonaid's description, and she was walking along Corrig Road with a man. What's strange though is this man seemed to be kind of hassling her, like they were having some kind of argument. But the motorist didn't think all that much into it because Raonaid kind of seemed to be taking control of the situation, and she had started to separate herself from this man. You know, she was already a few paces in front of him. At 12:03 then, she was seen at the top of Glenageary Road and Corrig Road, but this time she was alone. And this is weird because this is only a 7-minute walk away from Scott's pub. So why did it take her over 40 minutes to get there? It's not exactly the time or place to be going on a leisurely stroll. So did she bump into someone? Was that previous witness statement definitely her and she went back towards Scott's pub? Or did she stop on the way home to do something? There is a big question mark over that, but obviously we just don't know. And sometime around this point, although it's not clear exactly what time, which is unfortunate, there was a group socializing in a back garden and they heard some noises. They heard a female voice shouting, "Leave me alone," or at least something of that nature. And soon after that, they heard the girl say, "F off," followed by a scream. And after that, pure silence. According to another witness statement, just after midnight, there was a man seen running away from Silchester Road, which is where Raonaid was found, although this man who is running has never been identified. And then 12:20 p.m, Raonaid is found dead. And with regards to the crime scene, Raonaid herself was covered in blood and surrounded in blood, and she had been stabbed over 30 times, many of the cuts being superficial. Not only was she lying there on the footpath though, but she had clearly stumbled for quite a while down the path trying to get home because she had obviously been stabbed a little bit further away, and after being stabbed over 30 times, stumbled and eventually collapsed due to her injuries. And they can tell this because of the trail of blood that led up to her body. Also, two very important things to note about how Raonaid was found was A, she was not sexually assaulted, and B, she still had all of her possessions on her. So the motive for this crime was not sexual in nature or a robbery. And that's one of the greatest mysteries about this case, really, because there is no clear motive as to why someone would just do this to this girl. But it definitely doesn't seem to be random, because the sheer fact that she was stabbed over 30 times tells us that most likely whoever did this had some personal anger or some grudge against her. And there weren't any similar attacks around that area at the time, so it was unlikely to be a serial killer. But then also, because this was such a brutal attack, the killer must have been covered in blood as well. And I just want you to keep all these tidbits in mind, especially as we move into the investigation and the suspects / persons of interest on this case, because there's just a lot to consider. Okay, so getting into the investigation, obviously everyone who knew Raonaid was questioned, and the Gardaí, who by the way are basically the police in Ireland, the Gardaí Síochána, they looked at her friends both individually and collectively as a group. And there were actually a few of them who throughout the process came across as quite suspicious because they just conveniently couldn't remember certain details, but I will get into her friend group a little bit more in just a moment. At the peak of this investigation though, there were over 100 Gardaí assigned to the case. They conducted thousands of interviews, took thousands of statements, and followed up on God knows how many leads. So I'm going to just let you know about the profile of the killer that was released, and even though this wasn't released ASAP in the case, I do want to mention it before we get into the persons of interest, just so that it's kind of on your mind and you're aware of it. So the forensic profile of the killer suggested that it would be a young man in his mid to late 20s, that he would be single and either living alone or with his mother. He would have been a loner, not having many friends, possibly even having issues with drugs, and may have had some kind of mental illness or issues with his mental health. He also was likely to have a history of antisocial behaviour and unlikely to have a history of any intimate relationships. But possibly the scariest part about the profile that was released was they believed that this person would be likely to kill again. Although, I mean, we say that now and it is 22 years after this crime took place, and there doesn't seem to have been any similar attacks either before or after this crime took place in the entire Dublin region. The Garda Serious Crime Review team actually looked over this case and they suggested some new theories as well. First of all, they were adamant that this was not carried out by a random killer, that Raonaid knew her killer because there was no evidence of similar attacks. And they even suggested that Raonaid was killed by a female, which is interesting. I mean, I never would have thought that. They said that this local woman may have been known to Raonaid and killed her after some kind of personal disagreement or argument caused Raonaid to break off contact with her. And something that really supports this was there was a tiny little bit of female DNA found under one of Raonaid's fingernails. So that is interesting. But DNA was taken from over 50 women, and obviously everybody that she knew, family, friends, people who had been with her the night she died, or people who had been with her even in the days leading up to it, and none of these women were a match. However, what I will say is Raonaid had been working in a boutique all day, so it's possible that maybe this was just due to working around women all day, you know, helping them get clothes. Easily that could have explained this away. But then you don't want to put all the weight on that. I mean, this still could be significant. Okay. I am itching to get to the persons of interest here because, guys, like, you have no idea how many of them there are, and this is narrowed down. Guys, there have been over 200 persons of interest in this case, and even the Garda Cold Case review team flagged 22 of them as, you know, the ones who most likely, or not most likely, but were the most likely to have had something to do with it. And obviously I won't be mentioning all 22, God forbid all 200, but I'm going to talk to you about 9 in particular that are, you'll see. It's just crazy. It's crazy to me how there are so many, and there are a good few in here who are really, really suspicious and have a lot of circumstantial evidence piled up against them. But due to the fact that most, if not all of these persons of interest have not been publicly identified, we're gonna have to come up with like little nicknames for them, alright? Starting with Beige Guy. So Beige Guy is the guy that Raonaid was allegedly seen having some kind of argument with less than an hour before her death. He was a man in his mid-20s, approximately 5'10", and he had sandy coloured messy hair, said to be styled like Noel Gallagher. And we call him Beige Guy because he was wearing light coloured combat trousers and a beige top. He was obviously the last person Raonaid was seen with, so that already kind of implements him, but especially the fact that they were having a not so nice conversation and like an altercation almost, and he was seen to be hassling her. It definitely suggests that there could have been some kind of tension that could have led to a full-on violent outburst, maybe. He has never been identified, at least publicly, but it's not clear whether he's known to Gardaí or not. It doesn't seem so, but then it could be the kind of thing where they're building a case against someone and they don't want to release his name because he could be a flight risk. You just never know. The next person of interest we have is Taxi Guy. This one is really strange. In the early hours of the morning on the night that Raonaid was murdered, a man was picked up in a taxi in the area, and this man had blood on his trousers. Yeah, I know. Now, I don't know if this is a little bit of blood from a cut or something, or if this guy was fully covered in blood, because those would definitely suggest 2 very different scenarios. But I would imagine that it was at least substantial, because it was nighttime, it was dark out, it would have been pretty difficult to spot a bit of blood on someone's trousers unless it was significant. This man was between 20 and 30 years old, and he didn't fit the description of Beige Guy, so we're talking about a whole other person here. And not only did he have blood on his trousers, but he was acting kind of unusual. He gave the taxi driver an address and said that he wanted to get home before his girlfriend did, but then for some reason, a few minutes into the journey, he changed his mind and he gave a different address. And even after this, he was giving the taxi driver directions, basically bringing him all over the world to get to this one place. There were so many more very direct routes, but it's like he was going out of his way to be in the taxi for a long time, or maybe avoiding a particular street, or who knows. The taxi driver noted that Taxi Guy was definitely not intoxicated, and that tells us that likely whatever he was doing it on purpose, and he had his wits about him. Where he eventually got out in Newtown Park Avenue in Black Rock was only a short walk away from the original address that he actually gave. So it really just seemed like this guy didn't want the taxi driver to know where he lived. And to add weight to that, even when he got out of the car, he walked up to a house, but he didn't go inside. He just waited behind a bush until the taxi driver was gone. Or it seemed like he was waiting behind a bush until the taxi driver was gone. That's weird. That's weird. The driver clearly found this very strange, so when he went to the end of the street and turned around and drove back past where he left the guy out, the man was nowhere to be seen. Was this guy trying to conceal his address for some reason? And why else would you behave that way if you weren't trying to conceal your address? As the investigation went on though, there was a man that was arrested by Gardaí who they suspected could be Taxi Guy. This man was a chef but also a user of heavy drugs, and he was known to have quite the temper and also had a criminal record. And actually when the Gardaí found this guy, he had a knife on his person. Sure, I mean, this guy was a chef, but dude, like, do you really need it on your person at all times? So that just kind of got me wondering, because what I didn't mention is the knife that was used to murder Raonaid was never found. So I'm wondering if this particular knife was tested, because one of the safest places for a murderer to keep a knife that could implement him in the crime would potentially be on his person, because he knows at all times where it is, and he knows nobody sees it right now because I have it. Look, you know, we've got this murder weapon that's disappeared, and then all of a sudden they arrest a guy who's a significant person of interest in the case, and he just randomly has a knife on his person. Definitely makes you think. And speaking of his criminal record, let's just have a little chat about that. What we do know is he had previously been charged with a violent sexual assault against a girl outside a nightclub in Wicklow. Even the fact that it was outside a nightclub, it sounds like it was on a night out. This was a Friday night. I don't know. I might just be clutching at straws here, but I don't know. I just get a weird feeling about this. Something about Taxi Guy that I can't get out of my mind is he did spend some time in jail on unrelated charges, and allegedly while he was in jail he confessed that he killed Raonaid because she didn't want to have sex with him. Now obviously when this was brought to Gardaí's attention, they took him in and questioned him about it, but he denied ever saying it. I mean, of course he did. Even if he did say it, of course he would deny it after the fact. With all this said though, it does seem that Taxi Guy had a bit of an alibi, and I say a bit of an alibi because, like, I'm personally not fully convinced by it. At the time of Raonaid's murder, an outgoing call was made from Taxi Guy's apartment, obviously in the landline in his apartment, which, by the way, his apartment was on the opposite side of Newtown Park Avenue where he had been dropped off. But why I'm not convinced by this alibi, well, there's a few reasons. First of all, it's not clear exactly what time this call was made. Second of all, we don't know if it was him that made that call. Yes, it was a landline coming from his apartment, but who knows, maybe he had friends staying over. Maybe he was close enough to the pubs and bars and everything, and he was like, you know what guys, you can stay at mine. And maybe they were calling him because he hadn't come home yet. And according to the taxi driver's timeline, he still wasn't home until just before 1 a.m. By this point, Raonaid was already dead almost an hour. So he likely still could have committed the murder, made it home, and made a phone call then. Like I said, we don't know the exact time of the phone call. Now, Taxi Guy also mentioned a girlfriend, and I want you to keep that in mind for about 3 minutes. I'll get back to it in a sec. But obviously this guy was questioned very thoroughly, but there really wasn't anything that was enough to actually charge him with anything. Although the taxi driver was asked to confirm if this guy was actually the guy that he had in his taxi, and he confirmed that absolutely it was. And also, years after the fact, an investigator came forward to say that Taxi Guy had been known to Raonaid's friend group. So he's definitely not fully out of the woods in my eyes. Alright, next up we have the female friend. This is a big one. You might remember that I mentioned some tension in Raonaid's friend group. Well, most of this tension really came down to one person in particular. One of the girls in the friend group definitely felt quite inferior to the other girls, and in particular inferior to Raonaid. She was jealous of her, and apparently her boyfriend was obsessed with Raonaid. Now, I don't know if this is factual and if the rest of the friend group can corroborate this, or if it's just coming from this female friend. But I'm also wondering, could this boyfriend potentially be Taxi Guy? We know that he was known to Raonaid's circle, and he also mentioned a girlfriend. He mentioned that he wanted to be home before her, so was there some kind of trust issue there? If she got home before him, would she have been like, where were you? Were you out seeing this person or that person? Do you know what I mean? So is there more there that we just like haven't quite scratched enough off? I don't know. That is totally speculative. It is just a theory, but I think that could really tie things together if that were the case. But again, no proof at all. But back to this female friend, just her on her own. Not only was there a jealousy aspect, but she definitely was known to have a violent streak as well, and everyone in the friend group was quite wary of her. One or two of them even described this girl as psychotic. Okay, back in the 90s, pretty intense words were thrown around with not that much consideration for like how it actually comes across. You know, we're a lot more aware of how we can make people feel with our words nowadays, but I feel like that's an intense word to use. It must have been bad enough to use the word psychotic as opposed to just annoying or, you know, acting silly or, you know, what, do you know what I mean? I don't know. But something that really stands out about the female friend is she had family ties to the IRA. And that definitely could have made it more likely that this girl would be protected over the years, and also makes her a lot more untouchable when it comes to law enforcement and the Gardaí. Like, if you with one member of the IRA, like the rest of them are gonna stand up for you. So, you know, it's a whole thing. I don't want to get into it but you know, going after her could potentially mean massive danger for others. So, but then also the fact that there were so many superficial cuts, so many superficial stab wounds on Raonaid's body, this might suggest that it was a female perpetrator as well. Also important to note is that on the night of Raonaid's murder, a girl or young woman between the ages of 16 and 23 years old was seen nearby, and she had shoulder length dark hair. Now obviously the female friend that I'm talking about has not been publicly identified, so I don't know if that matches her description, but when this information came out, other members of the friend group were kind of wondering, could that be her? Now, the following morning, the morning after Raonaid was killed, it had been released to the public that a body had been found, but they didn't release her name until much later in the day. But the female friend that we're talking about informed the rest of the friend group that it was Raonaid still that morning. This was before her name was released in the media. So how did she know? Had she been speaking to Raonaid's family that morning and that's how she knew? Obviously news like this can spread so fast, and the first thing you do when you find out is normally tell everybody that knew the person. So maybe it's not that crazy, but even so, if she was speaking to Raonaid's family, why was she speaking to Raonaid's family? If she reached out to them, it could be seen as kind of suspicious, because she's kind of like, maybe she's trying to play dumb and be like, oh wait, what happened? Oh my god. Like, or if they reached out to her, then it's a different story. You'd imagine that if a person was guilty but also friends, obviously not friends if you are guilty, but do you know what I mean? If they had been friends with the victim, they could be being eaten alive with guilt and even just curiosity of what they might know. and they might not be able to help themselves but to call them up. Now, I find this all very suspicious, but this girl was not a match to the DNA that was found under Raonaid's fingernail. Still an interesting person to keep in mind though, I think. About a year after Raonaid's murder, this girl moved abroad and is still living abroad and only occasionally visits home. So could that be an escapism thing? Potentially. But then it's not exactly proof that you killed someone, is it? I mean, I want to leave Ireland too, but that doesn't mean I committed a heinous crime. Alright, next up we have Nightclub Guy. When I first researched this, I had no idea why everyone was bothering to mention this guy. Like, it didn't seem like there was enough information to actually be relevant to the case. And you might be thinking that as I get through the first couple of facts, but then there'll be another little thing that I'll tell you and you'll be like, oh. Which is what I was like. You find out some more information about this and it just kind of changes your perspective a bit. So something happened 7 weeks before Raonaid's death, and this was in July 1999. Raonaid had been on another night out and she was talking to and dancing with a guy in a nightclub, as you do. And later on in the night they were speaking in a local abracadabra, which is a takeaway, I think. And one witness said that this guy seemed like he was hassling her. He had a posh accent, although that's not all that unusual because this is South Dublin we're talking about. And he had short, spiky, light brown, sandy hair. He also had a slim build and he was either in his late teens or early 20s. And he had reading glasses on his head. And here's the thing, later that night she arrived at a friend's place totally flustered. We don't know exactly what happened, but she told her friend that she had been followed by someone and she refused to go back outside until a taxi was there ready and waiting. Now again, we don't know who Nightclub Guy is, but what we do know is his description is very similar to the description of Beige Guy. The only significant difference is Beige Guy had longer, messier hair and Nightclub Guy had short, spiky hair. The Nightclub Guy thing happened in July, and the Beige Guy thing happened on the night of the murder in September. Hairstyles can change, hair can grow. I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that maybe this was the same person. Authorities did actually release 2 composite sketches, one with the short, spiky hair and one with the long messy hair, and they do look kind of similar. So were these 2 separate people or was this one person? And if it was the same person, I mean, obviously they would have had their eye on Raonaid for a significant period of time. And sure, there was no sexual aspect of the crime, but it might not have even been like that. It might have been a pure anger driven crime because she didn't want to get with him. Okay, moving on to the next person of interest. Now, this will blow your mind that I even bring this name up because this name might be familiar to some of you, particularly if you follow my true crime TikTok, because I have actually covered the case of this man's murder.
It only came out that this guy was dead when they found a part of his leg. Charlotte Mulhall had been drinking and doing drugs with her mother Kathleen and her mother's boyfriend Farah. Then Farah started touching Kathleen inappropriately, with Charlotte still there, so this caused a big verbal altercation. Allegedly, Kathleen said, "Just kill him for me." So Charlotte slashed his throat with a Stanley knife and went on to stab him 27 times. Then her sister Linda whacked him over the head several times with a hammer, then dismembered and disposed of his body in the Royal Canal in Dublin. To avoid him being identified, Kathleen took his head in a bag on a bus. She went through the Square Shopping Centre, which I always used to go to as a kid, and she buried it.
His name was Farah Swale Noor, and Linda and Charlotte Mulhall claimed that he threatened their mother Kathleen during this intense drunken altercation and argument. According to them, he said, "I'm going to kill you just like I did with Raonaid Murray." And Kathleen told Gardaí that on at least 2 occasions he told her that he murdered Raonaid, that she was the friend of an ex-girlfriend and he knew of her, and that he stabbed her in that laneway with a knife. Obviously Farah was taken in for questioning, and after this they concluded that he did actually know Raonaid, but that he wasn't her killer. Now, they still believe that he did actually say this to Kathleen, but they also believe that it was more a massive attempt to just piss her off. just very interesting considering what ended up becoming of him. Not that it has anything to do with it, but how is there links to that? Like, it's just strange. Now, we do have another person of interest who was a guy who worked at a local hotel. He had had a few run-ins with the law, and interestingly enough, all of them were in some way related to acts of violence against women. He was questioned and fully denied knowing Raonaid at all, but according to her friends, he and Raonaid had definitely met before. But honestly, that's really all there is about that guy. I mean, there's no forensic evidence, there's nothing to place him at the scene, there's nothing to place him with Raonaid that night. Alright, next up we have a local butcher. This man actually confessed to killing Raonaid after a night of heavy drinking. And he also had a history of acts of violence against women. But again, not really any evidence though, or any motive, especially considering the fact that Raonaid was stabbed over 30 times. Like, you'd want to have a lot of high intensity emotions in you to do that. Alright, lastly, but definitely not least, we have another name that you might recognize, Graham Dwyer. This is a name that might also be familiar to you because I actually covered a case on TikTok where he was the murderer.
Not what you would expect from a leisurely walk in the mountains. A woman was walking her dog in the Dublin mountains and the dog was bringing her bones and everything. She thought they were animal bones. A few weeks later she went back and the dog was still doing it, but this time it brought some clothing. They found they were the bones of Elaine O'Hara, who had gone missing just over a year prior. Hang in there, there's more. Elaine had accessed this adult fetish website. She'd been in a lot of contact with a man called Graham Dwyer. These two had had a sexual relationship for a while involving knives, violence and bondage. But let's have a look at his texts. One of Graham's texts to Elaine said, "I would like to stab a girl to death sometime." Evidently, life in prison, bye bit. But he still gets bombarded with love letters from women who idolise him. Can we not?
So the reason I'm mentioning Graham Dwyer now is he said to his victim, Elaine O'Hara, "Whoever killed Raonaid Murray got away with it, so why can't I?" And I just wonder why Raonaid's murder stood out to him. I'm sure there are plenty of unsolved murders in Dublin, so why did his mind instantly go to Raonaid Murray? Now, I'm sure it was also very high profile, like it's quite a famous case in Ireland, but could it be relevant? But it could just be him having a fascination with murder and, you know, particularly unsolved murder, and that was just the first unsolved murder that came to his mind. He actually knew of quite a lot of true crime cases as a result of this fascination. Like, there really were a lot of texts between himself and his victim, Elaine, and one of the things that he had texted to her was that he could keep her locked up like Fritzl. Now, unless there aren't crazy alarm bells going off, Fritzl is referring to Joseph Fritzl, who's the guy who held his own daughter captive for 24 years and abused her the entire time. Again, not that that implements him in Raonaid's murder, but it's just interesting. But Graham also had been living near enough to where Raonaid was living. But then again, the DNA from Raonaid's murder did not match Graham Dwyer, so he has pretty much been ruled out. And if I was to be totally honest, I would have a gut feeling that he's not involved. I'm not saying he's not a piece of shit, because he absolutely is, but I don't think he carried out this murder, personally. But again, feel free to disagree with me in the comments. Okay, so we've been through all of the main persons of interest in this case. Now, I'd love to tell you one more strange thing that happened here. On the 5th anniversary of Raonaid's death, her family actually received an anonymous letter. This letter was expressing condolences and saying that he knew who killed Raonaid, and even that this person was known to police, because originally in the investigation at the very start, they questioned him, but they never really considered him guilty. And this letter didn't really hold much weight. It was kind of is someone just messing with us, or, you know, what's the story? But that was until they traced it back to who wrote it. And we've actually already spoken about this person today, and that is Taxi Guy. Taxi Guy, one of the main persons of interest in this case, wrote this anonymous letter. Of course, they brought him in for questioning, asked him what the hell that was all about, and he claimed that he wrote it to just take the heat off himself, which could be a legitimate reason, let's be honest. I mean, if he's not guilty, it must be really frustrating living your life when everyone kind of thinks that you might be guilty. Or maybe you could argue that writing this letter just makes you even more suspicious. Now, just taking it back to a few months after Raonaid's murder, her grave was actually vandalised, unfortunately, which is just so disgusting. And it was also vandalised multiple times over the years. And the thing was, it was the only one that was vandalised. None of the graves surrounding it were vandalised, only Raonaid's. So because of that, it doesn't exactly seem random. And I'm just thinking that if this really was carried out by someone who had a personal vendetta or grudge against Raonaid, maybe they still had intense anger inside them and still wanted to take it out on her. They could have just been harboring that anger against her for whatever reason it was, whatever that grudge was, even months and years after they'd killed her and taken her life. Or maybe they were directing the anger that they'd had at themselves towards Raonaid. Maybe they were angry with themselves for killing her. Maybe they had such intense guilt, and now the only way they could get that out of them was to take it out on Raonaid, because they obviously can't live as full a life as they would have wanted for themselves, and they have to lay low and live a much more concealed life because they killed her. So, oh, you know, it just must be so hard. Anyway, again, speculative, I'm just theorizing, but who knows? It's just the fact that it doesn't seem like a random vandalization. So I'm pretty sure Raonaid's family appeal to the public every single year to just try and get more information from people. A reward has been offered of €190,000, and they're hoping now that if someone either was involved or knows who was involved, that they've grown up themselves, they have that level of maturity to know what the right thing to do is and to come forward and give this family some answers. People who were involved or people who know who was involved might have kids of their own now, and they might even be around the same age that Raonaid was when she died. And I would just hope that maybe that would put it into perspective for them. Maybe that would show them what's really important. Because the fact of the matter is, right, someone knows something. The answer, the solution to this is inside someone's head, and that family deserve to know, and they deserve to know that the sick person who did this is being held accountable, because it's disgusting what this person did. They took the life of an innocent 17-year-old girl, and for what? Why kill her? Why murder her so brutally? That's absolutely disgusting. Alright, before I get too emotional because stranger things have happened, I think it's time to wrap this up. You guys know what to do. Drop a like if you enjoyed this video. Comment what your thoughts are. I mean, there are so many things to consider in this case. There's so many persons of interest to think about. I don't know. I mean, which person of interest stood out to you the most? Is there one in particular that you just have a gut feeling about? And if so, why do you think that is? I mean, we've got the female friend, we've got taxi guy, we've got beige guy, nightclub guy, and there's a whole host of others in there as well. And I do just want to say a massive thank you, because my last video, which was on the Delphi murders, actually got a lot more traction than normal. So I just want to thank you, because it is because of you that happened, because people were liking, people were commenting and sharing as well. And that is so amazing to be able to get that word out, particularly on an unsolved case. You know, more eyes need to be on these cases, and we cannot forget about them. So I just want to say thank you so much for that, and let's do it again. This case, yes, it's 22 years old, but you've got to keep hope alive. You've got to keep talking about it. You've got to keep getting more eyes on it. So if we can do that again, I'll be forever grateful, and I'm sure her family would as well. Now, if you're not a patron yet, I will leave that in the description below. It's just a tiny little amount every single month, and you help to support the channel and help me bring more and better content to you. So I appreciate anyone who ever decides to be a patron. You're just an absolute legend, and thank you in advance if you'd like to check that out. And just thank you so much for watching. I fucking love you guys. So cheesy, but it's true. Like, anyway, with all that said, I'm gonna go. So subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.